Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 17th Penn State Postdoctoral Research Symposium. So my name is Jingcheng Zhao. So I'm the co-chair of the Symposium Planning Committee, and I'm also a postdoc from the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. So with more than 400 postdocs at Penn State, our symposium is aimed to celebrate our research contributions and also showcase the impactful work across diverse disciplines. So this year's symposium features an exciting 2D program. So this afternoon, we will have a keynote speech followed by 3 panel discussions focusing on academia, industry, and DEI. So tomorrow, we will host 2 oral presentation sessions and 1 poster sessions. So where the postdocs will have the opportunity to present their research outcomes and receive constructive feedbacks from our judges and audience. So today, we will start with a keynote speech by a truly inspiring individual. So when I was a little boy, I asked my dad how to achieve success in life. So he taught me read 10,000 books and walk 10,000 miles. So in that time, I spent most of my time buried in textbooks at school, and I cannot imagine how anyone can do both things at the same time. It was until I came across a personal website. So as I learned about him, I realized that this is the person my dad was describing. So he has not only read 10,000 books through his great knowledge, but also has walked 10,000 miles through his diverse experiences and incredible journey. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shomir Wilson, who will share his story and experience with us. So please join me to welcome him with a warm round of applause.
Thanks, Jing-Chung, for that introduction. Really appreciate it. It's very kind of you, and thanks to the organizing committee for inviting me. It's really an honor to speak at this event. And apropos that intro, thinking about folks who do so many things at once, I'd say postdocs really qualify in that, having to do so many things in professional development and research, all while being sometimes on the academic job market or the industry job market too. So I'm Shomir. I'm an associate professor in the College of IST, and I spent 5 years as a postdoc, which in my field, computing, is considered to be relatively long. What I'll do is I'll tell you some stories from my experience and some things that I learned along the way. So first of all, I want to begin with a little positionality. So I need to acknowledge my identity, especially my scholarly identity, and how it's part of my perspective here. So I want to contextualize what I've been through. From that, you can compare it perhaps with your own experience. So first of all, I'm an associate professor, and I received tenure this past July. So I want to acknowledge I'm in a different place than all of you here. My research is also in AI, which right now is a discipline that's in a bubble, which has some disadvantages, but also some advantages as well. My work specifically is in natural language processing, which is the branch of AI that's all about interpreting meaning automatically from human language and doing useful things with human language. So think about technologies like ChatGPT or Google Search when you type in search terms and it gives you results, or maybe something like Siri on your phone or in your house. Those are products of NLP. So the challenges that I face might be different from those that you face, but I do want to try to speak generally here and talk about some things that other folks can relate to. One other thing I think I mentioned at the beginning is the fact that I was a postdoc for 5 years, but talking with postdocs, I find out this enormous variation and the expectations for how long you will be in that position before you get some kind of position after that, a career position. So, for example, in some fields, 5 years is pretty typical, but in others, like mine, many folks get into a faculty position straight out of the PhD, and I was maybe somewhere further along in that. So, because all of your work covers a variety of research areas, I am going to go light on the research content in this talk because it's really not that kind of talk. And I'm going to try to make any advice that I give germane to a variety of disciplines. I'm also, I think, going to go light on the academic job market advice. They'll tell you a lot about things that happen to me in the process. And I'm going to take that approach because the job market is kind of a personal thing in some ways. I always feel bad about doing anything that might encourage people to go that route if they don't want to go that route already, because it is so difficult sometimes. Sometimes, and that's a key word here, because I can think of 2 people I know who got offers for faculty positions after even interviewing just once. They got that lucky. And I've got a friend who got an offer after 0 interviews because the university knew her that well. But here are some other folks at the other end of the spectrum, like me, who had to try multiple years. So I think of that as a very personal decision if you want to do something that difficult. But I can tell you what I've been through, and maybe it'll be useful. I hope so. All right, so I'll tell you some more about who I am in terms of professional trajectory and recent experiences. And to do that, I clipped out here part of my CV, which you can, of course, find on my website. But something else I'll point out towards the end of the presentation is I actually share my CV template in a reduced form suitable for grad students and postdocs. You can find that on my website on my advice page. I'll explain more about that at the end. So you can see some basic details here. I've been in Penn State since 2018, and I lead something called the Human Language Technologies Lab. That's a lab that focuses in 3 research areas: NLP, privacy, and computational social science. And you can see also I've collected a bunch of affiliations with centers and institutes on campus. So the Social Data Analytics entity on campus, the Center for Socially Responsible AI, the Social Science Research Institute. Thing to note about those is often postdocs and even students can get affiliations like that. So if those kinds of institutes or centers on campus exist that you feel like you should have some affiliation with, go ahead and see if you can do that. Because if nothing else, it's a neat thing to put on your CV. So there's this other thing that happened here. You can see I was a professor, an assistant professor at 2 different universities. That first one is just for 2 years. And it's something junior faculty, junior researchers, including postdocs and grad students, often ask me why I moved. And I'll say, first of all, a full answer to that is beyond the scope of this talk, actually. But the thing that folks should remember is that academia, that includes being a postdoc and being a professor, is a career, and it's a job. And I think sometimes the scarcity of positions tends to make us think of it as an ideal, as this thing where you're just gonna find the place, your forever home, and just stay there until you're a grizzled old professor, and then you become emeritus and you're a professor for the rest of your life. But it turns out it doesn't work that way, actually. There are factors that go into how you feel about a place and how you feel about the rest of the market, and sometimes faculty do move. I'll tell you, having been in this position for a while, the more and more folks I meet who are also professors of senior positions, I talk with them about their trajectory, and they move as well. So key thing to remember here, well, why did I move? Academia is a job. It's not an ideal. And that distinction comes in handy too sometimes, because there's certain things you can do with a job that you can't do with an ideal. So I think it's important to remember that, regardless of how much you want the job, that it is a job. Right, so I can tell you 2 different versions about how I became a postdoc. This is something that folks in the room are past at this point. If you're a postdoc, well, why am I telling my story? There's a reason. It's because my way of getting here was kind of weird. And I suspect other folks in the room probably feel that too, that how you got here was kind of strange. You might feel a little embarrassed about it, like, why am I here? So I'll tell you my version. First of all, start with graduating. So I was a PhD student at the University of Maryland from 2005 to 2011. And when I graduated, it was kind of a rough thing that happened. There was a person in the room, in my defense, who was very critical of my work. Basically took out of me pretty much all of the pride I had in what I had accomplished. So when I graduated, I felt uncertain whether I'd accomplished anything of value. This weird position of feeling guilty to graduate. So that's not the simple version. That's just what happened before I got the postdoc position. The simple version of getting the postdoc position was, well, I needed a position somewhere, right? So I went looking around and I applied for a bunch of places. Eventually found this great one at Carnegie Mellon University, which is one of the top computer science programs in the country. Interviewed and accepted the offer. Bam, done. That's one version. And because of constraints of time, sometimes if you're just talking with a person at a conference, and maybe that's just what you have to tell them. But I have a little bit more time right now, so I can tell you more. So prior to that traumatic PhD defense, cue the question there, how did I really get my first postdoc position? Prior to that defense, I had a strong prospect for a position at a government lab. And it was something that seemed pretty reasonable. I talked with the person who would hire me. They were very enthusiastic. They were trying to sell me on the position. And I just wanted to, work somewhere and continue on that academic career track. So that did reduce my incentives for actually applying for anything else. I submitted a few applications, but kind of just half-heartedly. Well, after I graduated, that position went poof. They never made a firm offer. Turned out there were some funding problems. It just kind of disappeared. The person I talked with was very apologetic, but I was back on the job market starting with basically zero prospects. So I searched around a lot and I applied for positions in 3 different countries. I applied for some industry positions and had interviews, but they didn't give me an offer. I think they could tell that my motivation was elsewhere, that I wanted to stay in academia. And I applied for some postdoc positions at various places. One of them I remember was very cryptic to the extent the person wanted to make me an offer after exchanging just 2 emails. He wanted to know when I could start. And I asked, well, what exactly am I going to work on? His description was 1 sentence. And that made me feel kind of weird. I ended up not accepting that offer, kept looking around. Also got a firm offer actually for a position at a startup. And the more I talked with the founder, the more skeptical I was of what we were going to be doing. So I was in this very awkward position partway through my job search of turning down an offer when I had nothing else going for me. But it just didn't feel right. But things took a turn partway through that summer of 2011 when a friend at Carnegie Mellon University was walking down a hallway she normally didn't walk down, and this building she normally didn't walk in. She was just doing something different that day. And she saw a flyer for a postdoc position. Now, this was 2011, but even in 2011, that's not how you advertise postdoc positions. But there was a flyer, so she took it to a copy machine nearby and made a copy, and then took it home and scanned it in because smartphone cameras weren't that good back then. And she sent it to me. And I looked at this and I remembered, I actually saw this ad before. I decided not to apply for this because it looked way out of my league and on a topic that just wasn't relevant to my research. But I decided I need to do due diligence. A person sent it to me. Now what I've done is I've got to apply for this. Okay, so I applied for it. And I thought all the while, this is a waste of time. This is not worth it. Felt a bit of self-loathing applying for this position. Submitted the application, then they interviewed me. It's like, okay, this is not what I expected. And then they made me an offer. And that was stunning, this turn of events. That I had been squashed like a bug in my PhD defense. postdoc position I thought I'd get went poof. Now I'm gonna end up at one of the best places I wanted to be at. So I accepted the offer and I started there. So this is a combination of a friend, due diligence, and luck. And adding more to the luck aspect of it is the fact that one of the reasons this friend focused on this flyer was there was this buzzword in my research I mentioned. It was on the flyer. About 3 months after I started, found out my supervisor had a completely different idea of what that buzzword meant. But it's too late, I was already working there, he already liked me. So that was my start. So I'll tell you about what I did. And I'm gonna go light on the research details here once again, because it's not really that kind of talk. But I'll show you another part of my CV. This is clipped from my affiliation section. You'll see here I had a few different positions. I wasn't just at CMU, but let's walk through this chronologically. I was a postdoctoral fellow at CMU 2011 to 2013. Then apparently I went and did this other thing, 2013 to 2014. I had this NSF-funded fellowship. But then I went back to CMU 2014, 2015. I had this same NSF fellowship, sort of. And I also had this lecturer position for some reason. And then back at the same lab, 2015, 2016. So the thing I looked at in my CV when I was on the academic job market, I was trying to look at this like a hiring committee, and my reaction was, wait, what? What is this person? So I'll tell you what I was doing, but then I'll tell you why it doesn't matter the reasons that I thought it mattered. So one of those postdoc positions I applied for before accepting the offer at CMU was actually a fellowship from the NSF to spend a year abroad as a postdoc at a university of my choosing. And I wanted to do that because that was one of my life goals, to spend an entire year living outside of the US to get a different perspective on culture. I'd done short versions of that as a graduate student when I spent 10 weeks at the National University of Singapore and 10 weeks at Macquarie University in Australia. I wanted a bigger chunk of that. So I applied again, and on the second time I got it. So because of that, I left that first postdoc position thinking, well, I might not come back, I might get a faculty position, but I didn't. I'll show you more about that later in this presentation. So I had to return to the original lab. At the time, it felt shameful. Like, why am I back here again? I was supposed to be gone. Well, the short version is I reinvented my portfolio. As a postdoc, I did very different things than as a PhD student, and I wanted to go on adventures. As a postdoc, you get those opportunities sometimes, and it's important to take them not just for your career, but for your satisfaction with life. So living abroad was an enormous adventure, and it's something that I look back on with a lot of thought of how that improved me. Many of you folks are living abroad right now, and I hope that's an adventure for you too. Getting back to the concern, the reason why I felt like maybe this would look bad, well, turns out when I interviewed for faculty openings, no one asked me about the sequence of events. No one. So if you're in a position where you're looking at your resume and wondering, well, what does this look like? Don't be too concerned about that. What you should be concerned about is all the other things in your research portfolio and your teaching portfolio, perhaps, that should impress people. How you got them, it turns out not to matter as much as that. So I mentioned that I wanted a tenure track position. That's been my career goal since college, actually. Early on in college, I saw what faculty were doing, and I had a nice perspective on this as part of a residential community program that brought in speakers from across campus, and I saw what they told us about. I saw how much they loved their jobs, and I thought, well, I want to do this someday also. But that took a while. I mentioned 6 years grad school, then 5 years of postdoc. So I was on the academic job market for 4 years before the first offer, then 2 more years to get here, and here's where I finally felt like I might be at home. So I'll tell you what happened a little bit year by year. 2012, 2013, that was my last year at CMU before moving to Edinburgh. I submitted just a few applications thinking, well, these are the places I'd go to, even if it meant not being able to live abroad for a year. So very few. Then while I was at Edinburgh, submitted more applications. And this is, well, let's try a little bit harder. Third year, I was back at CMU, and it was my last year of funding on that fellowship. Thought, you know, I should probably get a postdoc position. I mean, I'd probably get a faculty position. Still got 0 interviews, 0 offers. So after that, thought, well, I really need to get a position, and I submitted that much larger number up there, which turned out differently. That time I actually started getting interviews. But it was a significant draw on my well-being, and I think about the one evening when I submitted so many applications. It's gonna start on the next one, felt physically ill, decided can't do any more, feel sick. That's when you know you should stop. But I started actually getting these interviews on site, and so that sort of brings up the question, well, how did I keep going? And I don't think there's any one answer to that. I can't tell you something simple like read good books or make good friends or think positively, because I think that's different for all people, and I think the most stable answers involve lots of different sub-answers in them. But for me, all 3 of those things, well, yeah, they were important. Thinking about what I wanted, having good friends who are in the same position, fellow postdocs. And one of the reasons I'm glad this event exists is because it gives you an opportunity to get to know each other and find moral support. But also, yeah, reading good books. So I finally got offers that 4th year, but when I arrived at Cincinnati, I felt like it wasn't quite the right place for me. And remember what I said, this is a career, it's not an ideal. It's a job, it's not a forever thing. So I went back on the job market, and I got 2 interviews the next year. This is 2016, 2017. No offers though, felt pretty bad about that. Then finally 2017, 2018, got 3 offers and took one of them to come here. So I show this, and I said at the beginning, I don't like to encourage people to go down this path, but I also don't want to discourage you too much either. Here's the thing. I don't think it's likely any of you will end up in this situation, because one of 2 things is going to happen before you spend 5 years on the academic job market, almost certainly. One of those is that you'll get what you want sooner. You'll be luckier than I was. I was pretty unlucky. The other possibility is something even more important will come up, and you'll consider what you have in your hands, and you'll think, well, it's time to set this aside. I got something even bigger I need to do. And when that happens, I hope you think of it that way, that you actually have priorities, that this isn't a monolithic goal, it's one thing in your life, and your life has greater scope. So along those lines, I think it's also important to remember it's okay to want big things. You shouldn't feel guilty for wanting the career that you've been thinking about for years, but it's also okay to change your mind, right? That happens too. And hopefully the people around you will be supportive if that's what you decide someday. And you can tell, I think by talking with them, the amount of support they have for you. Okay, so that was perhaps the most negative part. I showed you the most personally taxing part of being a postdoc for me, but I want to tell you the good parts too. So in my field and in computing in general, conferences are a big deal, which is to say we actually publish in conferences more than we publish in journals. We have journals too, but the conferences are where a lot of the real exciting activity happens. Also happens to be that our conferences have published proceedings, and they're around the world. Some of them rotate around the world every year. So as part of that, I was able to travel a lot. You can see that in all the pictures in this presentation. Those are pictures that I took. traveling often for work, sometimes adjacent to work, because it took a few extra days to get to know a place. So on the map there are the two universities where I had postdoc positions in red, and the orange ones are places where I went to a conference across 3 continents. So this map also doesn't include all the personal side trips they added to work travel. So this is a big deal for me because travel was something that I wanted to do a lot starting in undergrad when I got the impression I just wanted that to be part of my life. There's also something even bigger than that though, which I held back earlier on purpose. So I didn't mention earlier who that friend was who sent me that flyer for that postdoc position in 2011. She was actually my girlfriend. So getting that position solved for us a 2-body problem which had gone on for 6 years as we're at different universities for grad school. And that might be the luckiest I've ever been in my whole life, landing both the solution to the 2-body problem and a postdoc at a great university for my work. And since then, we've been in the same place, more or less, modulo a few months. We got married in 2015, and we had our first kid last year. He's gonna turn 1, I think, in about a week. So that was enormous for me, getting that through as well. So there were also the work accomplishments I told you about, travel and my personal life. I did reassemble and rebuild a portfolio that had kind of come to a halt after my PhD, because my PhD work didn't have much of a future to it, at least I thought at the time. I switched from being a researcher in computational linguistics to usable privacy, which is a hot topic and continues to be. I was also working at these 2 universities in my field and getting the publication portfolio that I wanted and that I needed for a faculty position, didn't have already. There were also personal connections that came as part of that. So I made friends at my home institutions there and at conferences and while traveling. And I reflect on having done that, having made those connections and how it changed what I thought about this term networking that we tend to sort of force on people who are searching for a job of any kind. So I think that term networking has these fatigue-inducing connotations, like get out there and network, it's this sterile activity. I think part of the problem is that when we use that term, we seem to be prizing utility over anything else. So when I think about trying to get to know people now in a professional setting, I don't think of the network as the activity so much as the product. The activity is have interesting conversations. I don't think how this person's gonna be, so just talk about something you think is interesting. And maybe you'll remember them, maybe you'll keep in touch, maybe not. But that was the case with networking to begin with. So my attitude towards all this changed, and I made friends and valuable connections, and sometimes the overlap existed and sometimes it didn't. So you look at this and, well, you can listen to me speak and think, well, wasn't all this great? And I'd say sure, but sometimes it didn't actually feel great. Because all the while this is happening, well, that other thing happened. That chart that I showed you, spending that many years on the job market and feeling futile about that. So it was difficult sometimes to recognize the success amongst the failures. And there are strategies we can do to try to bring those out in our personal lives. But I think it's also sometimes the case that perspective comes slowly. That you can't realize how great of a thing that you've done or that you've experienced until a few years later. And the meaning, I think, can also sometimes come slowly. What did it mean for me to be on the job market that long? What did it mean for me to be a postdoc much longer than a lot of the other faculty that I knew? So that's, again, a personal thing, but I can tell you for me, one of the most redeeming parts of my work as faculty is being able to talk about those things and to maybe have an impact on students' resilience. To be able to tell them about those 4/6 years and say, well, things ended up working out and I did all these other things along the way that made it in other ways worthwhile. Right, so I'll tell you then how I got out, how I maybe not escaped from being a postdoc, but the next thing that happened and how it happened, apparently on a bike. So here was the end game. Simple version first. Here's the timeline for my first, for the offer for the faculty position I first accepted at One University of Cincinnati. And you can see here, this stretched out for nearly a year. I submitted the application in August of 2015 towards the end of the month. That's relatively early for an ad to be out in computing, but I saw this ad and I applied for it. And remember, this is the year I submitted over 100 of these things, so it's just, waiting and pouncing on them. Well, they interviewed me early also at the phone interview, that is, at the end of September. And the on-campus interview was soon after that in October. Again, all this is pretty early for computing. And the fact it was early made it even more perplexing when for just over 5 months, I heard absolutely nothing from them. This is kind of a puzzle. And meanwhile, I was interviewing for other positions. I had this in the back of my mind, I interviewed, I'd like to hear something. Well, what happened was at the end of March, they told me I had to apply again and that there was some new opening. My interpretation of that, which turned out to be reasonably correct, was they had actually filled the position I applied for, but they still liked me enough to maybe try to hire me into another one. So, okay, I submitted my application quickly. At that point, I was pretty good at submitting these things quickly. And just a short while after that, I got the phone call for a verbal offer. And that was great to hear. And that started the standard process that some of you might go through eventually. This is late for computing, being in April. Received a written offer after that, after negotiation, and then accepted the offer on July 1st. Start date was August 15th. So nearly a year went by between when I submitted my first application at this place and finally started in the position. Remember, that's the neat version though. So I'll add some other things to it and tell you about the untidy version, because there are a lot of other things happening in the same year. One of them was spending about 170 hours on planes, and that was across faculty interviews, but also going to conferences, a few other professional obligations, some personal obligations as well. And that's, if you reduce it to 24-hour chunks, that's about 7 days on planes. Depending on who you are, that might sound really cool or might sound terrible. I actually lean towards the really cool side myself. That was an incredible experience, even if it was kind of disorienting at times. And I remember about 2/3 of the way through it, I'd gotten off the bus going to work. I was walking to my campus at CMU and just having this philosophical discussion in my head about what it meant to be at a place when I'd been so many places. It was strange, but it's also fascinating. There was also another item here, the fact that I got a verbal offer that never fully materialized after 4 months. They kept telling me, we're gonna make you an offer. We're gonna make you an offer. We're going to, we just need a little bit more time. That offer never became solid. I had to accept the other offer at Cincinnati first. And I sometimes wondered, well, if I had to wait or two, what would I have done? I don't know. There's also a short notice interview in June of 2016 at a university in the UK. And this is a place that I knew well, and I was glad to interview there. After that, there was this time period, and you can see it reflected in the timeline, where I wasn't sure in just a few short months where I was gonna live, what country I was gonna live in, what my job would be like, what my life would be like. And that period of uncertainty stands out in my memory as well, as something I might never experience again. And then, okay, finally after I accepted this one offer, there was a conference in Europe I had to go to that was the week before my start date at the new university. What that meant was actually returning to the US the day before the movers arrived for our stuff. And for that, I'm really glad that my wife was there to help make that work. So it was pretty untidy, and there was more than that even than I've listed here. A while ago, I made this list of strange things that happened to me during interviews. Some of them weren't all that strange, but they're remarkable. I'll tell you just 4 of them here. One time when I needed a little bit of help figuring out something on a faculty application, I emailed someone at the university, asked them, hey, do I ask this question to you or to someone else? They sent me an email address that they said was for the search committee. So I sent an email to the search committee asking this question about how to apply for a faculty position. Turned out that address was the email list for the entire faculty in computing at that university. And hundreds of people got my email. I got a variety of responses, some of which were angry, some of which were genuinely trying to help, some of which were confused. And that was deeply embarrassing. Add on top of that the fact this was actually at CMU where I was working. So I made a quick exit that afternoon because I just didn't want to be around. Okay. Lived through it though. Something else that happened. During one of the phone interviews, right at the beginning of the phone interview, I saw, okay, I'm talking with 3 faculty members there. Sorry, not phone interview, Zoom interview, saw them. One of them, outside of camera, picks up this sheet of paper, holds it up, points at it. It's one of my recent publications. He points at it and tells me, this isn't interesting. He didn't really have a question. He just wanted me to know, this isn't interesting. He flips through it, this is just not interesting. So I felt obliged to defend what I had, published. And I guess I must have made an impression because I interviewed there later in person, they invited me. And that person was then totally chilled. I like to think his colleagues told him, calm down. Because they even then made me that verbal offer that I mentioned. But I thought, well, maybe this isn't the place for me. Something else that happened, this is for a research scientist position when I was back on the postdoc market towards the end of my NSF fellowship. I wasn't sure if I could go back to my first lab, so I was looking at these other options. I gave a talk at a place with about 20 people in the room. When we get to Q&A, hand shoots up, person asks me, name one thing your work is useful for besides helping people. I was flustered. So I came up with an answer besides, all the other things I'd said during the talk. But in retrospect, that's a very perplexing question because I hope many or all of us in the room are doing research to, help humanity. And so I think about that in retrospect as an unapologetic part of my research portfolio. I want to help people. There's also a time when I had flight problems on the way to the interview. I was going to connect through LaGuardia. Well, the weather was so bad in LaGuardia, we tried to land there twice, and we ended up landing in Boston instead. But along the way, while this happened, I started a conversation with my seatmate. Turned out she was eager to talk with anyone at that point because she was also trying to get to a faculty interview, different university. She also lived in Pittsburgh. She lived just a block from me. And that turned out to be a useful conversation for my morale. And she and I still talk sometimes about that experience. Same interview, by the way, managed to get there, arrive at the building where I was going to give my talk just 10 minutes before my talk started. Walked in with squeaky shoes because there's snow on the ground outside, just set up, and basically just started talking. One of the best talks I've ever given because someone in the back of the room cheered at the end of the talk. Thank you. Still no offer. Okay, one more along those lines. One of the times interviewed in, 2017, checking out at the hotel after the interview felt really good. The cherry on the top of the ice cream was the fact that waiting in line with me to check out was a woman with 2 miniature ponies in the lobby of this hotel. I've never seen a miniature pony in my life, but they're pretty cute. What is this? So I talked with her there's apparently a miniature pony convention in town. This must be some kind of omen. Even though I don't believe in omens, I can tell it like that. I still didn't get an offer. But here's one where it worked the other way around. At least one of the faculty applications I submitted during that last round, 2017, 2018, I put the wrong university name on the top of the cover letter. And I know this because they actually emailed me and said, hey, could you send us the correct cover letter? You sent us the one for Georgia Tech instead. Says deeply embarrassed and started writing an email very apologetic, then realized, no, play it cool. Played it cool. Sent the correct letter. They interviewed me. I accepted the offer to work here. That happens too. And hopefully those of you who are on the job market will see this both in industry and academia. It's a good sign when the people on the other side of the table are human. It's a good sign for a work environment. Right, so that's the untidy version. Right, so some takeaways here. I'll try to summarize a few of the things I've said, but I want to be brief on that, and keeping in mind this thing that a senior person in my field recently said when she received an award at a conference. During Q&A, someone asked her if she had any advice for people just getting started in our research field. She said no, because people never listen to advice. Crowd laughed. I think people sometimes do listen to advice, but I think it has to be light advice. It has to be, well, here's what's worked for me. Don't know if it's gonna work for you, but for what it's worth, consider it, and maybe you can take some part of it, maybe all of it, maybe some of it, maybe nothing. So I think it's important to remember academia right now for all of you. It's a job, it's not an ideal. And the fact that it's a job does mean you get certain flexibilities you wouldn't as an ideal. You can decide you've had enough at some point. You can't do that with an ideal. But you need to remember that no matter what happens next, because you need to keep that flexibility. I think it's also good to remember the importance of friends and due diligence when you see an opportunity. There are times when you know it's really not for you, but if you're on the fence, well, you've got to think a little bit deeper. And then also luck. I think it's important for us who have been lucky, you folks in the room included, your postdocs, to remember that when you're talking with people who haven't been lucky. And then it's also okay to want big things. It's also just okay to change your mind if you want. That's entirely on you, especially if the big thing is something really difficult and personal. And then that final one, sometimes perspective comes slowly, and that's important to me as I give talks like this, as I write some things on my website that people have read, that I didn't have any idea at the time how significant all this could be, that I could actually tell stories about it later on and maybe benefit for other people. So I mentioned those advice pages there. If you go to my website, shomir.net/advice, I've written a few different things. One of them is an academic job market guide, and I qualify it at the beginning. Remember, I'm in computing and other academic job markets work differently, but there's some generalizable principles there and some things that I went through. There's also a guide to professor speak. So I wrote this because I think my job's interesting, but I found it is helpful for talking with people about what it's like to be a professor. With all this jargon that faculty use about things like indirect costs and R1s and the AAU and the AAUP. So if you're interested in that, then take a look. I also wrote more about a lot of the experiences that I shared today. I wrote more in particular on failure and competition and uncertainty. And I'm glad to be able to share those kinds of things since I'm in a position now where I don't really feel that vulnerable about them anymore. And that's a kind of privilege that I need to acknowledge, that I can share things like that because I'm at this different point in my career. So that's it for me. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for your presentation of your wonderful experience. So I really enjoy it. So now we will take like 1 or 2 questions.
Thank you for the very inspiring and supportive lecture. I was wondering around the job offers you received, what do you think clicked there? You didn't provide a recipe for it, but still, maybe you can tell us something about what made a difference in those successes that you had.
So follow one question about your question. Do you mean in terms of where I accepted an offer or where I interviewed or something else?
I mean about being being given an offer?
Okay, yeah. What made the difference where I was given an offer and where not? To a large extent, I don't know, actually. In a few cases, I can pin it down. In a few cases, there was someone who happened to know me, even if I didn't know them, who happened to be at the university. So that helped in at least 2 situations. In other situations, I still don't know to this day. They looked at my portfolio and okay, maybe it said something about AI in the ad, and I was an AI person. But even back then, there were lots of AI people. So it's difficult to factor out luck in situations like that because they don't see the other side.
Thank you.
Maybe one last question.
Thanks, that was really inspiring. I was just wondering, like you said, it's like difficult to stay motivated when you send out so many job applications, and I think for me that's where I am right now, and I think maybe more people in this room are in that stage. You said it's like key things are to have good friends and to read good books. Can you give like what kind of books, or do you have specific titles, or like how do you stay motivated, like what books would you recommend?
Sure. Actually, the message I meant to get across was I can't summarize it into those things. I did those things, but it was so much more. But for what it's worth, what books did I read at the time? That's a good question. I've always liked humor when I read, so that probably helped. I think more than that, since you mentioned the friends part too, that was a big deal. Knowing another postdoc who is in Pittsburgh also turned out to be great for my morale in retrospect. And it was good actually that she and I weren't competing in any way at all, like completely different fields. So we could talk very freely about our experiences and not worry about that kind of thing happening. So another great reason for having this kind of event, you folks can talk with people where you don't have any kind of like shared fate. So say what you wish.
Yeah, so due to the time, so we will have a 10-minute break, but you're welcome to talk with Dr. Wilson during the break. So we will be back in 10 minutes. So we'll start our academic panel discussion at 2 p.m. Thank you. And thank you again, Dr. Wilson.